Look, one of the most staggering dollops of nonsense this week was from Daniel Andrews, who said that he's running a tighter coronavirus ship than is the case in New South Wales. And wait for it, I lead higher standards. He must have a hide as thick as that of a rhinoceros. He justifies limiting the increase on international arrivals to Victoria on the fact that, quote, we will have less capacity because we have a different model. I lead higher standards. I mentioned last night about 40,000 Australians who can't get home. New South Wales and Queensland are doubling their intakes, but don't worry. Daniel Andrews has told us he's made about 50 improvements to Victoria's quarantine program. Aren't we glad of that? Because the bloke with self-proclaimed higher standards is now forced to acknowledge that the hotel quarantine cluster in Victoria has grown to more than 11 cases. How many in Queensland, Daniel? Who have doubled their intake of international passengers. How many in New South Wales? The higher standards are such that the Melbourne outbreak has led South Australia to close its border from the Greater Melbourne area from midnight last night, and now Queensland, a few hours ago, as a result of Daniel Andrews' higher standards, is reimposing border declarations for people travelling from Victoria from 1 a.m. Saturday. Where does this nonsense end? Every case seems to me a response from these so-called leaders as if the patient had been bitten by a brown snake. When are Australians going to wake up that Daniel Andrews can boast dishonestly about higher standards, but he joins a long line of so-called leaders in this coronavirus response who aren't really leaders, bootlace? The alarmism that has dogged us in relation to coronavirus and the fear that's been injected into the population and still exists today has to be dismantled. The federal Liberal MP Kevin Andrews, no relation, recently unsuccessful in pre-selection for the seat of Menzies, addressed this brilliantly at the end of last year in a piece for The Spectator magazine when he said, and I quote, I never thought I'd live in a police state. Surely democratic Australia would remain a bastion of freedom in which any restrictions were a last resort, applied precisely, consistently and proportionately to a clearly identified threat that can no longer be said in the state of Victoria. Kevin Andrews, not Daniel Andrews, Kevin Andrews, the outstanding Conservative thinker who still holds the seat of Menzies and has in the National Parliament since 1991. Sadly, we lack the kind of splendid thinker that Andrews is. In relation to Premier Andrews boasting of higher standards, Kevin Andrews reminded us that in Melbourne, most residents last year were placed under house arrest for 23 hours a day, I quote, movement where people was restricted to a 5-kilometre radius, businesses closed for weeks and jobs destroyed. The state parliament, he said, was closed on the orders of a mid-ranking bureaucrat. Further, quote, a pregnant woman arrested in her own home for posting on a Facebook page and surveillance cameras set up in public parks, unquote. Now, I say this because why do we seem to forget all this? Surely we can't allow Daniel Andrews and his government to get away with this dictatorial behaviour. Don't politicians deserve to be punished for this denial of basic freedoms? Are these the higher standards Daniel Andrews is talking about? How has the population been so ready to accept, even embrace, this state of affairs? Kevin Andrews answers this in a brilliant piece of writing about the Daniel Andrews with self-proclaimed higher standards, and I quote, fear has been corralled for the purpose of imposing autocratic rule. The potential spread of COVID-19, the rate of infection and the projected number of deaths was exaggerated from the outset. Requests for the modelling, writes Kevin Andrews, modelling employed were ignored or rejected. There was no consultation, he says, about the proportionality of the response or the impact on the economy. Writes Kevin Andrews, whole communities were placed in lockdown when the actual deaths were in aged care homes and the infections a consequence of a failure of quarantine, inadequate testing and poor tracing. He says these failures were used to generate more fear in the community. And remember, writes Kevin Andrews, quote, as deaths spiralled into the hundreds, no one accepted responsibility. Writes Kevin Andrews, not the Chief Medical Officer, not the Commissioner of Police, not the Emergency Management Commissioner, not the relevant ministers, and certainly not the Premier. And this about the Premier of higher standards, writes Kevin Andrews, Daniel Andrews' fear has fuelled division in the community between police and citizens, between residents of Melbourne and rural Victoria, residents of different states, A ring of steel was imposed on different communities. Borders are closed and interstate travel virtually banned. People are encouraged to dob in anyone whom they suspect to be breaking the rules. Unquote. Well, if these are the highest standards, none of us want to see the lower ones. The cult of Dan seems to excuse and defend anything the Premier says and censures and disparages any criticism of him. He won't appear on this program. He won't allow himself to be challenged. But mark my words, as Kevin Andrews wrote, and I quote, all the hallmarks of a totalitarian regime are emerging. The cultivation of an atmosphere of distrust and the feel of citizen against citizen, the overuse of police and regulatory powers to restrict movement. Writes Kevin Andrews, and I quote, witness the daily media conferences of the Victorian Premier, the possessor of all detail, the bearer of all knowledge, continually blaming the citizenry for the failures of his administration, unquote. And these are supposedly the higher standards. Splendidly, Kevin Andrews quotes the 19th century observer of the American democratic experiment, Alexis de Tocqueville, who argued that eventually liberal democracies, this is the warning, would lose their liberty. This is where we are today in this country. Listen to de Tocqueville, and I quote, society will develop a new kind of servitude, which covers the surface of society with a network of complicated rules through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. It does not tyrannise, but it compresses, innovates, extinguishes and stupefies a people till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrial animals of which the government is the shepherd. Unquote. Of Premier Andrews with self-proclaimed higher standards, Kevin Andrews wrote, the vital associations that underpin democratic society have been smothered. Gatherings, including religious services, even with appropriate social distancing, have been banned, unless it's thousands of anarchists and left-wing demonstrators. Writes Kevin Andrews tellingly, there are many lessons from the pandemic, amongst them the need to ensure that future responses are proportionate to the risks, precise in their breadth and consistent in their application. Personal responsibility, he writes, underpins democracy. It, not authoritarian power, must be the foundation of our future action, unquote. I'm telling you, we swallow this Daniel Andrews rubbish about higher standards at our own risk. I've said over and over again, and I'll say it again, Australians have got to start reclaiming their country and their freedoms from Canberra down.